Hey guys! So today you and I are going to talk about doing too much. So let's get into it. So the question in question was, hello Frederick, admire your work. You cover topics which other tech channels don't. I have a topic request. How do I know exactly whether I'm doing work worth the salary I am paid for? And whether I am over or underworking? Well, so usually that is a fairly straightforward thing. You need to look at the skill set that you have and the sort of work that you do in the industry in comparison to other people. So usually the best performing software developers, they will have a wider skill range than most others within the role that they have. And they're usually the sort of people who provide a lot of support to other developers on either complicated matters or things that go outside of what they can do. You identify them very quickly. If you usually have a few of those people in the company where it's a person who sort of knows everything, or a classic one is for when I work with front-end developers, where like the more like they don't usually know anything about, say, DevOps, but in the companies that they find themselves, more and more they realize that actually you need to know quite a bit about DevOps, because most companies are expecting software teams to run that and run a DevOps operation. And so you usually have a few full stack developers or someone who really knows this sort of stuff and basically always helps out with that stuff, because most of the front end developers don't know how to, say, debug a CI pipeline or performance issues or things like that. They really don't. And that person might be a front-end developer, like be hired as a front-end developer. That's a person. That's the sort of person I'm talking about. It's an individual who has a wider skill set. They can basically handle a wider range of tasks than what the average person with their specific roles can do, right? And that's usually when that's a good benchmark for you. It's the same thing with, if you're underworking or so forth. It's the underworking and so forth really comes down to, like, how well do you handle the circumstances within the environment that you find yourself, and are those requirements that you have in the environment proportionate to what's considered normal, which is a difficult thing to define, of course, for the industry at large. So an example would be, as I've said a few times, guys, if you I like to take the front-end developers here because they have such a clear-cut area for this, but the back-end developers have the same sort of phenomenon. So for a front-end developer who might have been working primarily on static websites, and like I've seen front-end developers who literally have, like, they don't even write the network calls, they just do the HTML and CSS, but they don't do any of the JavaScript or like API calls, and they are surviving in a very specific environment, but they would basically never be paid the sort of money a front-end developer gets paid for mainstream large-scale software development, where you have to do that because if you hire such an individual for that job, well, then you basically have to hire somebody who does like something else for them, which is fundamental to their workflow, which slows down the whole process. It becomes very inefficient, basically. But say someone who's overachieving, and this is where it becomes very, because this is a dangerous question for me to answer, at least from my perspective, because now, if I tell you that, well, if you do more than everybody else, then you are worth more money, or that you're underpaid, or so forth and so forth. I can't tell you that that is the case. What I can say is that there's quite a lot of people who will want to believe that, the ones that are talented, that you are worth more, etc., and that you do so much and so forth. Like, you're the one who always writes unit tests and stuff like that. And I try to tell people, guys, that's a card you can play maybe with your manager, but the sad reality is that it's an expectation that you should write unit test. You're not going to get a pat on the shoulder for doing that. What you will get a pat on the shoulder for is if you can do something that goes beyond what people would expect from the role that you have. As I was saying, if you are a full-fledged full-stack software developer and you have DevOps experience in, say, when you work as a front-end developer, then you are much more than the average front-end developer. That's the sort of thing I'm talking about when I'm saying that you have to be honest enough with yourself to realize that there's a difference between, doing well within an area, like being a really good backend developer or being a really good front end developer or something like that, and being something that is like basically it's like having more than one speciality. It's you're so good at this thing, so productive, so well working that most of the other developers can't either keep up with you or they literally cannot do the work that you do. As I said, it's the same thing with backend developers. There's a lot of backend developers who have no idea how to work with, like, say, Kubernetes or Ops or anything like that, which is a fairly fundamental thing, or becoming more of a fundamental thing for every team these days. That's the sort of person who basically is almost always going to be underpaid unless they find a company or something like that where these sort of expectations, like that they work at a higher level. And that's the red thread through all of this, guys. It's all about how much do you match the common expectations, and do you know what common expectations are. In the beginning of things, it might be difficult for you to sort of figure that out, but as you work with more and more people, like these days I've interviewed and worked with so many different people within roles that I sort of know what the at least I have a pretty good gut feeling what is the benchmark for an average software developer, which means that's very useful for me, of course, when I'm hiring people, because I know who's going to be really good or like who has above average knowledge and skills and so forth, and people who are not so, so forth. And then we have like the average people, like, yeah, I know that they're going to be able to do a solid job, but they're not going to be able to do A, B, and C, and so forth. And so it really comes down to something as simple as that. Do you know what is expected of you within your role on average in the average company, and are you able to do more than that? And so I will also finish by saying something that is important to mention. At some point, guys, you will reach, depending on, not all of you are going to do that, it's that simple, but some of you are going to reach a point where your passion or you basically just keep on learning, and you get to a point where you can literally run the entire department, where you are like a unicorn type of software developer. And these people, they do exist, guys. They're not that common. Like, most software developers stay at the mid-level, but the ones that really burn for this industry, they usually get to a point where they can handle the deployments, they can do the front end or the back end or both, or so forth and so forth. It's a one person show, like they can do all of the things, and they usually are the people who can provide support in different areas, and like they have a really, really wide skill set. And the problem is that most companies are hiring for a specific sort of role. You're either a front-end developer or a back-end developer. Like, they're going to love you for being able to do all this sort of stuff in many cases, and in some cases they don't really care if you know how to, like, because they hire you for one thing and then they have other people doing that. So you can't really get an environment where you can be you can't be seen, and you can not truly flourish, and you're going to get paid just as the other people, even if you can do 100 things more, right? And this is where most people either start their own company, or like become consultants or something like that, or they try to go into very specific roles, like these sort of what I call more mature roles, where you might be site reliability engineers, or you might be consultants within a specific area, you might become CTOs, you might become staff engineers, principal engineers, like where the width and the ability that you have to solve very complicated problems that usually require a much wider skill set is in demand. And that's the important bit. The context, like because not all companies are going to appreciate that you know 100 things, because they only need you to do one thing. So what I want you to take away from this is that figure out if you're overpaid or you're doing too much work for your pay and so forth, or underworking or so forth, is really down to figuring out what is the benchmark, usually the common expectations of the industry. And so that's where you have to really understand, are you a really talented front-end developer, a really talented back-end developer, or can you basically run the whole show? Like, do you know how to debug all the things and fix all the things? And can you do things that most commonly associates with, say, other roles or so forth? Your skill set is that diverse. It doesn't have to always be diversity. It can also be highly specialized stuff where, like, you might be a really, really talented performance artist or things like that, where your knowledge extends from what you see from most people in in your area. Not just that you're a little bit better at things and you know a little bit more about testing or these sort of common things that makes you talented in your area, and that's great. You can get a little bit more pay for that for sure, especially if you're working at the lower ends, because there can be a mismatch. You can be like a world-class software developer in, say, front end or back end, and you're working in this tiny little startup or you like this backwards company. Well, I'm not saying backwards, but like a company doesn't really reward that, because all they really care about is like Bootstrap or like something basic like or WordPress sites or so forth. And you might be able to, you're probably like sort of mismatched. It's sort of like different levels of athletes. You're in the wrong league, if that makes sense. But at some point you will realize that when you get to a point where you're like world class at like something, it becomes basically impossible for you to just continue getting paid more and more and more just for doing the same sort of work, because most companies can't really, it's hard to measure people at that talent level, so they usually start their own company or they go into very specific roles which are fairly high paid. As I said, there are plenty of companies who are looking for, you know, the top brass within the areas, and they will pay fairly substantial amounts of money, assuming now that they have the sorts of needs that you can help provide, like basically the skill set that you have is in demand. And I've seen these guys and girls, guys, they're like skill level that they bring is really high, but it's actually very difficult for them to get paid the sort of money that they are worth, because the reality is, guys, that there is a cap for how much you can make as basically anything, unless you're running your own business. You're most likely not going to see like that level of compensation unless you have an arena or a market or a company or something like that where they realize that, where they understand the value of the work that you do. But you can definitely spot if you're being paid fairly by just doing this basic analysis. How well do you measure up in terms of what you can do, the diversity or the complexity of the tasks that you're dealing with. The tricky part is to find someone who understands that those skills are worth more compensation. Have a great day.